The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Multinational corporations in every sector are pulling out of Russia. Will the economic pain that inflicts matter to those in power? We'll assess the impact tonight. Then our Ontario Hubs put a focus on the rising problem of harassment facing healthcare workers in the province. And from what motivates Russia's war to the new era of conspiracy theories in Canada, we've got the Agenda's Week in Review. It's Friday, March 11th, and that's ahead on the agenda. Factories went idle, retail, food and beverage, financial services, credit, all shut down. It would be easier to list the companies not pausing operations or pulling out of Russia entirely as a result of the invasion of Ukraine. With us for more on the economic blowback in Russia and beyond, in New York, Charlotte Howard, U.S. business editor and New York bureau chief for The Economist. And in Ontario's capital city, Mark Warner, international competition, trade and investment lawyer with Mall Law. And Brian Milner, longtime business and economics writer. Welcome to you all. So this first question is for all of you, but Charlotte, I wanted to start with you. It seems like the private sector reacted to the invasion of Ukraine incredibly quickly. Have you ever seen anything like this before?
It's really been of a scale and speed that is unprecedented. You saw companies that had spent decades building up their business in Russia all of a sudden abandoning it in a matter of days. BP in particular, this huge international oil company, had a really close partnership with Rosneft, had a big stake in Rosneft, Russia's state-backed oil company. And between Thursday, the day that Russia invaded, and Sunday, they took the decision basically to just leave that stake. It's unclear how much of their investment they'll be able to recoup. And
Mark, have you seen this before?
Not on the scale or the speed. I agree with Charlotte. I haven't really seen this before. I would caution, though, that we're not sure what this really means just yet. Some of the companies are leaving completely, or they say they are. Some are suspending operations. And so you really have to drill down in the corporate communications to try to figure out exactly what they're doing. But it's certainly what is new and unique is that companies are saying that they want to distance themselves from Russia. The extent of it, how far and how deep it goes, I think remains yet to be seen.
Okay, and Mark, you brought up some great points. We're going to get into that in just a few moments. But Brian, what about you? Have you seen this before?
No, never on this scale. We're talking about more than 300 companies that are basically pulling up stakes or suspending operations literally in a matter of days. Now, some of them are doing it for financial reasons. The Russian market is obviously going to get much weaker. The economy is going to plummet. And so for good business reasons, they would have been cutting back anyway. Also, they have some financing issues because banks aren't doing business with Russian banks. And so there's that issue. But on the other hand, the other big issue is the reputation issue. Will my reputation suffer if I stay? And the answer right now is yes.
We will get into that in just a second. Charlotte, what is the difference between the government sanctions imposed on Russia as compared to the private sector pullout?
Well, the two are related, right? So the West has imposed really draconian sanctions on Russia of a scale that we've not seen before, even as the use of sanctions has really ramped up over the past decade. What they're doing now is of a different scale, in large part because they're going after not just the private banks, but the central bank. And so you've seen this really steep decline in the ruble as Russia's economy becomes more isolated. But the private sector actions are important, and I think they're important both substantively in that they will help to precipitate real economic damage within Russia. And then I think they're also important politically because it's very hard for Vladimir Putin to argue that this is just a small scale operation in Ukraine and don't worry about it when all of a sudden a Russian consumer walks down the street and they see that The Starbucks is closed. The McDonald's is closed. They can't go into Zara to buy something. You see their bank accounts taking a real hit as the ruble declines, and then just everyday life in Russia looks dramatically different.
And also, if maybe they lost their job because those companies or shut down in Russia. But you said something that I wanted to follow up with. You said that these are draconian measures. How are they draconian measures?
Well, in the past, if you look at the sanctions that were imposed on Russia after the annexation of Crimea, governments tried to be more targeted. So, for instance, they might sanction individuals who are close to Vladimir Putin, or they sanctioned the use of certain type of energy activities in Russia. So the sanctions after 2014, they really went after deep oil and Arctic exploration, for instance, to make it much harder for energy companies to work with Russia on some of those projects. ExxonMobil, because of those sanctions, pulled out of certain projects in Russia. But right now you see not just targeted sanctions, but really going across the whole board. And in particular, I'd highlight those actions against the central bank.
And Brian, you mentioned reputation. We know now that on social media, a hashtag can destroy a company. We would like to think maybe that these companies are pulling out for more reasons. But, you mentioned reputation. So why do you think companies have been so quick to pull the plug?
Well, as I said, reputation is important to these companies and the safety of their brand name. But what we're seeing is the fact that Russia doesn't have a really strong economy. It doesn't produce a huge amount of profit for these companies. In general, it's a small portion of their international business. So they can say, let's get out of here for a while. You didn't see them do that in China when sanctions were put on that country over its treatment of the Uyghurs. You don't see it in some other countries with terrible human rights records if the economy is really booming and they make a lot of money there. So yes, Apple's not selling any more of its products in Russia, but they're still selling a lot of them in China.
Well, when you're comparing the effect of government sanctions versus the private sector withdrawal, Charlotte mentioned that if you're in Russia right now and if you go to McDonald's and you notice that McDonald's is not there, obviously you know that something is up. What do you think will have the most immediate effect on everyday Russians, the effect of government sanctions or the private sector withdrawal? Brian.
Well, the fact is that they both have an impact. And as Charlotte said, the impact of retailers leaving the market is a lot of empty shops, a lot of people losing their jobs, and telling people what's going on. The government's telling us that everything's fine and there's no war in Ukraine. It's just a simple military action. So why are Western companies doing this to us? Now, the Russian answer to that is, well, they're just ganging up on us and showing and illustrating why they're so dangerous. But from the Russian perspective, if you go on Friday nights and line up at McDonald's for your Big Mac and you suddenly can't get it, you're going to start asking more questions.
And Mark, Brian mentioned China. There are still companies, I'm afraid to ask this question because things are moving so fast, but we know companies that have pulled out, but there are companies who have decided to stay. What do you think that signals to companies that have decided to stay in a country like China?
Well, I think that there are different kinds of companies that face different challenges. So, for instance, if you're in an auto company, say you're making Volkswagens over there, you can say you're shuttering it down, shuttering your plant. What at the worst the Russians can do or the government can do is take it over. But if there are no parts coming in, they can't really make the Volkswagen and sell it in Russia. So there's some sense that if you close the factory, if this comes to an end and people decide that they want to have peace again, you can go back in fairly quickly. So I think when you see some of what the companies that you leave or say that they're shutting things down, it's so far, some of it is, it's not necessarily as huge, it's big, it's a big move. It's just not necessarily as, how should I say, as consequential in terms of the long term as I think people in the moment might think it is. Like if you're in the extractive sector or even in the oil drilling sector, a lot of what major companies were doing was things that the Russians wouldn't be able to take over. So if you stop doing it, at some point, either the Chinese will come in, and that's a concern, or the Russians will just have to stop it until such point as the Western companies can come back in. Some companies reflect their nation state. So, Exxon has to answer to shareholders to a large extent, the United States, and BP has to answer to the government of Britain to some extent, and so does Shell. But if you take a look at France, total France, they're looking at it and they're saying, oh, we're not really getting out. We might not make new investments, but we put a lot of work into this. You see the French bank saying similar things. So part of this also follows, the culture of the companies. I'm reading very closely to see some of the companies like McDonald's. I remember the first time I went to South Africa after Mandela came to power, and you had all of these companies, these shops, these retail shops that looked kind of sort of like something you might have seen in North America. But in fact, they were just the companies that have been taken over. And then, of course, the companies had to spend a lot of money and time once the sanctions were lifted in terms of getting their brand and their name back. So that's one of the reasons why I think you saw McDonald's and Starbucks a little bit later to act, because that's kind of what their risk is: the intellectual property, the trademarks, the branding, and that sort of thing.
Charlotte, I wanted you to pick it up from there. How big is the Russian economy compared to the U.S. and China?
Well, China's economy is about 10 times the size of Russia's. So I think that, to my colleague's earlier point, there's a reason why some companies are really fine pulling out of Russia, whereas they might stay in China for a long time. Apple, of course, has an enormous consumer base within China and then also produces all of its iPhones there. So it's just a much different calculation. Also, to date, China has not declared active war, right, on a neighbor. So that's important to keep in mind as well. Human rights abuses, of course, have been factoring into companies' decisions, but there's not been an outright conflict in the same way. I think that it's worth keeping in mind, though, that even though Russia's economy is small, it is an absolutely enormous supplier of commodities on which the world depends. So, of course, oil, it's the world's third biggest oil producer. It is an enormous producer of wheat. It's the world's biggest supplier of wheat. It also is home to all kinds of metals that are crucial for the global economy: nickel, aluminum, copper, you name it. So, and of course, Europe is very dependent on Russian gas. So even though the sanctions within Russia can prompt some companies to leave without too much pain, the broader implications of isolating Russia are huge because of the commodities it supplies.
And Brian, at the heart of this, there are a lot of people in Russia who are not to blame for what's happening in Ukraine. When these companies do pull out and people lose their jobs, I wanted to talk to a bit more about how economically healthy is the middle class in Russia.
Well, the middle class is not in great shape these days because the economy has been struggling for some time, the domestic economy. Russia is really dependent on exports of raw materials, natural resources, and hasn't really evolved into a strong industrial base, hasn't developed a strong industrial base. It's sort of was moving toward that, and that's one of the reasons that it has been importing Western technology. It's been developing nascent industries and building high-speed trains and its own high-tech equipment and consumer goods, but it's way behind. I mean, when you look at the per capita GDP of Russia, it's about $11,000 a person, which doesn't sound terrible, but in Canada, it's about $45,000. And the fact is that 220 Russians control 40% of the entire wealth of the country, which means not a lot gets down into the lower levels of society. The middle class is doing just fine in the big cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow. But if you go out into the countryside, you're looking at a pretty poor country.
Mark and Charlotte, this question is for you. I'll start with you, Mark. For the companies that decide to leave, what's going to happen to the capital assets of those companies? Mark?
Well, I think that the Russian government has said that they're looking at nationalizing them if the companies go. I think the deputy prime minister, said last week that the companies have three choices. They can stay, or they can leave but hand things over to local Russian managers and owners and come back when it's all over, or 3, if they exit entirely, they need to get rid of all their employees and they need to leave for good. And I guess the implication being that the Russians will just take it over completely. So we'll have to see where they go with that. That's something will play out over the next day or two. There's still some cards that the Russians haven't played yet, right? So Charlotte did mention, I think, some of the important other raw materials. You know, we are living in a global economy, and it's not just a talking point. It's actually real. So Boeing uses titanium, which largely comes from Russia at this point, to make their planes, and they say they have an adequate supply. Air France is another company, happens to be French again. They're saying, I'm not Air France, I'm Airbus, European company, but based largely in France. They're saying they're staying in Russia and using the titanium supply from Russia because they need it. So there are a range of concerns that companies have, and we'll see how it plays out over time. I think just how far it really goes. I'm trying to, as I said, read some of these press releases a lot closely to just see what some of the companies are actually really doing, whether they're shutting down new business or existing business.
Mark, you've mentioned that a couple of times. Do you not believe what the companies are saying?
Well, I think here's what I think. The lesson I've learned over the last 2 years, first with the pandemic and this, is the corporate communications business must be doing really well. So I think you need to be a bit skeptical, and you need to discount probably by about 25-50% of what you're reading, and ask questions. If you read a comment about what a company's doing and it doesn't actually say what it's doing, then I think you should ask more questions.
And Charlotte, to pick up on that, to be a little skeptical of what the companies are communicating, what is going to happen to the capital assets of those companies that do decide to leave?
Well, it depends, right? American companies don't have what's called a bilateral investment treaty. America doesn't have a bilateral investment treaty with Russia, which would allow an American company to protest against a Russian takeover, a Russian seizure of its assets in international arbitration. So an American company would be at the mercy of Russian courts unless it owns its Russian assets through a foreign subsidiary that does have such a treaty. So that sounds a little technical, but basically it points to the real quandary that some companies face, which is the Russian government takes over something that you own. What can you do about it? Can you recover any of that value? I think one of the reasons why the press releases are a little hard to read is because I think a lot of companies really don't have good answers to these questions at the moment. They're figuring this out in real time. I was speaking with some people at BP, and they are going to try to figure out what the value of their assets are at the end of the month, at the end of March. They're not sure who they'll be able to sell it to, what will happen with those assets. It's a lot of money. It's up to $25 billion that they might leave. We're not talking about pocket change. So I think it varies a lot. There are a lot of aircraft lessors, which are businesses that lease planes to Russian carriers, and they're trying to recover hundreds of planes that are in Russia. How on earth do you do that? I think that there are big write-downs that we're going to see in the next couple months from some of these companies.
Mark, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say about that because I think it's worth noting again that if you take a look at some of what these companies are doing when they say that they're going to write it down, they're not going to record the value of the assets, and they're not going to receive dividends, and that's great from a corporate communications point of view, from a corporate prestige or reputation of the brand. But it also means that if this reverses fairly quickly, they haven't actually disposed of those shares or those assets and can reverse it fairly quickly. It becomes an accounting exercise. So that's part of what you need to watch for as well.
All right, so let's move on to the issue that everybody's talking about right now, is the oil and gas issue. Brian, what percentage of the global supply of oil and gas does Russia control?
Well, they are the third largest oil producer in the world and a major gas producer. Roughly, and I'm not 100% sure of this number these days, but it's roughly about 10 to 12% of all the oil. And of course, they are the major supplier of oil and gas to Western Europe.
And Charlotte, President Biden recently announced that it will ban Russian oil imports to the U.S., which will send the price of gasoline even higher. How tolerant of high gas prices are Americans? And it sounds awful to ask that question considering what's happening in Ukraine.
Well, all politics are local, right? I think that there's been an interesting amount of bipartisan support for America to be tough on Russia, and you saw some bipartisan support for the idea of an oil embargo. America doesn't actually get that much oil or gas from Russia. It's less than 10% of its imports come from Russia. But oil is a fungible commodity. Prices will go up. They will affect ordinary Americans. And I think President Biden is really contending with high inflation as a political problem going into this year's midterm elections. So I think that people may say in theory that they like the idea of being tough on Russia, but then they go to fill up their car and it's really expensive, and then that becomes a real political problem. You've always seen presidents worry about prices at the pump. Donald Trump, when he was president, would take the extraordinary measure of openly calling on OPEC to increase production to bring oil prices down. This is something that all presidents are focused on. And I think President Biden has a real communications challenge to try to maintain support for tough measures as prices continue to rise.
And the next question is for Mark and Brian. I'll start with you, Mark. In terms of replacing Russian oil from the international market, is Canada in a position to make up the difference?
I don't think we are in the short term. I mean, you hear people talking about Keystone, but the pipeline wasn't finished. So that's more of a middle to longer term solution. Obviously, if we want to get the oil and gas to Europe, we would really need to do something in terms of our own pipeline, or to help would be an east-west pipeline, which is kind of impossible dream, I think, in Canada. So, there's probably I don't think that we're going to be able to be the country that replaces completely the Russian supply. I just don't think that's something we're able to do. And that's why I think the Americans are going after, which is kind of interesting. They're trying to get Venezuela back on stream, which is kind of ironic because part of the supply into the United States was because the Russian supply in the United States was because they had sanctions on Venezuela. So now as we have sanctions ramped up on Russia, you have American government officials in Caracas trying to see if they can figure out a way to get Venezuelan oil back on stream. And you also have the Iran nuclear talks going on in Geneva. So that's also another source of supply. So those are the aspects that they're looking. But the real spigot that Putin hasn't played yet is the Europeans are in no position to turn off the supply, just to stop buying. And if Putin really wanted to be angry, he could basically say, okay, I see where you're going, I'm going to shut it off. And interesting thing, one last comment of what was announced by Biden, is it doesn't include a pipeline that comes from the Caspian Sea, which is very important because it crosses through Russia. And again, that because it crosses through Russia, that means there are nodal points in Russia that Putin can say, well, if you're not going to buy my oil and gas, if you're not going to buy my oil, basically, I'm just not going to let it be transported, this oil coming through the Caspian Sea through my territory. How do you like that?
And Brian?
Well, in fact, there was a big energy conference in Houston, and the Canadian participants said that they could probably replace about half the Russian oil in the U.S. market over the coming year. And obviously, they would be able to do more if they had the Keystone pipeline and if they had some of these other things sorted out. Also, they have to start producing more on their end. And one of the big problems is that even in the U.S., which really could be self-sufficient if they want to be, frackers stopped producing more oil because they were being pressed by shareholders to give out higher dividends, so they stopped investing as much. Those are things that are going to take several years to reverse if that's the way it has to go.
In our final minute, Charlotte, you wrote in a recent Economist article that, quote, it took more than 30 years for BP, a British energy firm, to build its Russian business. It took less than 4 days to decide to dismantle it. Now that so many companies are leaving, how likely is it that they'll ever go back?
Well, I think as we've discussed, I think some companies are hedging their bets by suspending their businesses rather than leaving them. But I take particular interest in what the energy companies are doing. They're not all doing the same thing. We heard about how Total, a French energy company, is not leaving altogether. But all of these companies are really having their eye on the long-term plans for the energy transition. And as they try to decide where around the world they want to invest, they're thinking about a range of factors that include the cost of drilling, how clean it is to drill, how much methane emissions there are as drilling continues, and the political risks. And I think in Russia, those risks, that math, it just doesn't add up anymore. And I think that they'll be really hard pressed to see some of these companies who are leaving now return with big investments into Russia.
Thank you all so much for helping us understand this complicated issue. We really do appreciate your insights. Thanks so much.
Healthcare workers have carried a huge burden in this pandemic, and the strain of that takes a toll. As the 2-year anniversary of the first lockdown in the province approaches, our Ontario Hub reporters spoke to some of those frontline caregivers. With us on what they heard in Thunder Bay, Charnel Anderson, who covers the Northwest for Ontario Hubs, and in the Hammer, Justin Chandler, who covers the Hamilton-Niagara region. Welcome to you both.
Hi, Dan.
All right, according to Ontario's COVID-19 science table in 2021, more than 60% of healthcare workers, including doctors and nurses, said they'd leave the profession post-pandemic. Justin, why is it important to bring their personal stories to Ontarians?
So the idea behind this series was that while a lot of people may have heard about harassment against healthcare workers or about stress that they're feeling maybe from organizations, or maybe just because they intuitively know that this is going to be a tough time for people working in these fields, we felt it was really important that people could hear directly from people, to hear their stories in their own words. And we think that gives a really valuable insight into what's going on, and a really sort of personal level that makes it easier to understand.
Now, Charnel, many journalists have tried to cover stories on this, myself included, and trying to get people to talk about their experiences in the healthcare sort of industry. Why do you think it's so hard to get people to talk about it?
I think on one hand, it's just the nature of the topic. It can be really difficult for people to talk about issues like abuse and harassment and mental health, especially in such a public way. And it can be risky as well, right? If you're talking about workplace issues or your employer, and your employer catches wind of that, it could potentially cause problems for your livelihood. And that's what I heard from people that I spoke to that didn't want to go on the record, is that they're worried that if they speak out, they may lose their jobs. So for many people, it's really a matter of weighing the costs and the benefits of speaking out about these really serious issues.
Justin, for one of your articles, you spoke to a Hamilton nurse who had experienced harassment, and in her personal story, she had mentioned that, she always had to be between the patient and the door because that was sort of the quickest exit if anything had escalated. What did she say about the working conditions where she works?
Yeah, this was Sonia Bernhard in Hamilton, and she told me that, especially during the pandemic, probably once a shift, workers are going to be experiencing some sort of violence or harassment. I actually just spoke to her recently before we were recording this, and she says that she's recovering still from a violent incident that happened at her work last week where herself and several other people were hurt. So what she told me was that this was something that always existed before the pandemic. It wasn't uncommon to experience violence or harassment, but that now that hospitals are more overcrowded and nurses were doing more with less, it was just more likely that you were going to come up against something. And some of these things include maybe being thrown to the ground or being almost stabbed with a needle, which are things that she said she's experienced, or even sexual harassment and violence.
Charnel, hospital shortages have also taken a toll on healthcare workers. Some say that they feel like they're doing more harm than good when they're helping their patients. How does that affect someone like a respiratory therapist that you spoke to?
So I spoke to a woman who I'm calling Samantha. That's not a real name. She requested anonymity because, she's worried about what her employer may think of her speaking out. And so Samantha's a respiratory therapist in Toronto who's currently on sick leave, and she's been on sick leave since last year after being diagnosed with depression and anxiety. And it was at one point during the third wave when she realized that she wasn't sleeping properly anymore. She was losing lots of weight. She was crying more often. And she told me that going to work was like walking into hell. She said, if a fourth wave comes, I'm going to shatter. And so the biggest issue for Samantha wasn't necessarily abuse or harassment, but it was the breakdown of the team and the conditions under which they had to work. because of course hospitals are interprofessional settings. Healthcare workers in different roles work very closely together, and they're there to support each other as well as the patients. But because of the sheer number of COVID patients and the severity of the illness, not to mention issues in healthcare that predate the pandemic, Samantha felt like she wasn't as effective as she could be. And as you say, she felt like she was doing more harm than good. And so that was, really distressing for Samantha, so much so that she was really reconsidering her career path. And thankfully, Samantha's been able to find support for her mental health. And it sounds like she would like to ultimately return to her job and be there to support her colleagues in their mental health as well.
Just in follow-up on that, are there any mechanisms for reporting some of these issues so workers can get that support?
There are. I'll give you a yes, but answer. So, okay. For example, I spoke to Leela Pa, who's a Niagara paramedic for another piece in the series, and she was telling me about the harassment the paramedics experience. And paramedics can go to their employee assistance program. There's workplace violence programs, peer support. She says there's also a strong informal support network. But sometimes healthcare workers will say that's not enough. So, for example, Sonia Bernhard, she was telling me that for her, she actually cut back down to working part-time because she just felt that at the rate things were going, there wasn't enough support, and she would want to leave the profession entirely. And one of the things that she said was that she really thinks we need to flip the script when talking about burnout, because in her feeling, when we talk about people getting burned out, it maybe puts some blame on them. And she thinks that we need to look more widely at the system and ask whether people are getting the adequate support that they need, because it's her view that they're not.
Now, Charnel, you're in Thunder Bay, and I think it's important that we put some context into sort of smaller communities there. How does this play out in, say, the Northwest region that you cover?
When I think about problems with healthcare in Northern Ontario, one of the first things that comes to mind is persistent doctor shortages. So some communities only have 1 or 2 doctors to care for an entire community. For example, in Manitouwadge, a community of about 2,000 people, last summer their resident physician quit. And luckily, within a few months, they were able to hire 2 new doctors. But, it goes to show how precarious adequate healthcare is in smaller communities when if one person quits, the whole community is in jeopardy. And that's not to mention First Nation communities where most often there's only a nursing station with nurses in the community. So attracting and retaining healthcare workers in rural communities is an ongoing issue. A recent study about this issue published in the Canadian Journal of Rural Medicine looked at physician turnover in rural and northern communities and found that there's a range of factors that influence a physician's decision to leave. And that includes a lack of career prospects for their partners, a lack of opportunities and amenities, and burnout. And so some of that is just kind of the nature of life in small northern communities, but problems like burnout and other mental health issues can and need to be managed in order to address the shortage of healthcare workers. So that's, one way that healthcare workers can be better supported. Another kind of more novel way that the Thunder Bay Regional Health Sciences Center is exploring is hiring PSWs to support its nursing staff. So the hospital's hired over a dozen full-time PSWs, and they're not a replacement for nurses, but they're there to kind of help lighten the load of patient care. And this is a temporary measure meant to address staffing shortages as the hospital resumes normal operations. But hopefully it does help to take some of the strain off of healthcare workers in the community.
Charnel, Justin, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. Of course, these are some really eye-opening personal stories from healthcare workers, and it's an ongoing series at tvo.org, so I really want to thank you for your contributions there.
Thanks, Jan.
Take care.
The agenda this week examined the role of Russia's oligarchs, surveyed the current disinformation landscape in Canada, learned what goes into writing a party platform in Ontario, and assessed the availability of culturally relevant dementia care in the province. The agenda's week in review begins looking at Russian President Vladimir Putin's motivations in launching the war in Ukraine.
What do you think of the perception that Americans want to be loved, Russians want to be feared?
Well, I would say the Russians seem to be having more success in their goals than the Americans are, if that is the goal. I do think there is a sense in Russia that the world is a dangerous place. You think about Russian history, some of the dangers, it's true, have come from inside Russia, like the Communist Party, but a history of invasion, a history of sort of constant threat from East and West. Since today, whether it's from Islamist terrorists and rebels in the South, China in the East, NATO and Europe in the West, Russia, there is a kind of a sense that the wagons need to be circled, the people are in danger, and maybe we are safer if others fear us. I think that that's there, but let's not forget this other Russia. There is a liberal Russia. There is a humanistic Russia. I think all of us on this panel have traveled in Russia and know many people in Russia who are absolutely citizens of the world, fantastic, cultured people, deeply immersed in Russian history, but also very open to values and ideas that come from around the world. And to simply say that Putin and the Putinistas are Russia is to concede a point I really don't think we should ever concede.
Understood, and absolutely fair point. Yvonne, again, you being over there and in the midst of all of this, I want to try this on with you. We've heard, I mean, there have been some very unusual examples of anti-Russian behavior since this war started. Everything from calls in Canada and the United States to prevent Russian hockey players from playing even junior hockey, let alone in the National Hockey League, to restaurants not wanting to serve Russian people, to vandalism at Russian restaurants. Anyway, we're seeing lots of examples of this. How do you sense the rising hostility to Russians from your perch in Europe?
Listen, you have it, and to be honest, I very much agree with Walter, and I'm very much worried by this. First of all, there are Russians in Russia who oppose the war. There are almost 2 million people that signed different petitions. You cannot imagine what kind of a risk these people are taking. You cannot imagine how difficult it is in this early moment in which the vote is divided between us and the enemies to say, no, we are the guilty party. And when we're not trying to distinguish between those people who are basically trying to defend basic human values in this situation and treating them simply like Russians, I do believe this is the worst that we can do about the future relations with post-Putin Russia. Nevertheless, when this post-Putin Russia is going to arrive, and nevertheless how it's going to look. I was recently talking to a close friend of mine. She's a cultural figure. She started one of these first petitions, and she said, when I was in Russia, I was treated as if I'm a Ukrainian because I'm a traitor. And then when I went out of Russia, I was treated like a Russian. My credit card didn't work. People basically who don't know me, doesn't want to speak to me. I do believe that it's so important to make a distinctions. Russia is not simply Putin. Even more, there are people who are taking a risk which is comparable to the risk that people are taking in the occupied and besieged Ukrainian cities. And if we're not going to make this distinction, I do believe we're going to have a huge problem in the future trying to explain to people why we reduce the country to one man.
Seva, can I get you to follow up on that? How concerned are you that people are not making the distinction between Russia and Putin?
Well, I do want to say as a Russian, somebody who was born in the Soviet Union and who grew up there and speaks the language, it's not the primary concern for me at the moment. I think the people of Ukraine are the ones that are suffering more. But as with anywhere, collective guilt is a very bad place to go historically. And holding regular people responsible for their government's crimes is the logic of a terrorist. If a European leader had called in 2003 to expel American students because of the US invasion, people would have said that's idiotic, and they would have been right. And yet here we are. So I, as much as Putin deserves the scrutiny and the venom and the suspicion, I think we will see a lot of another decade of, well, everything bad that happens in Western society must be tied to the Russians. And I hope people don't automatically make that connection as a way to distract from the internal problems of the West as well.
How would you characterize the relationship between Putin's government and the oligarchs?
I would say that I wouldn't even talk about Putin's government. Vladimir Putin controls the oligarchs. They exist at his pleasure. So at any point, if they're not doing what they're supposed to do, they can have their money taken away, they can be imprisoned, or they can be killed. And when I mean in terms of what they need to do in order to satisfy Vladimir Putin, the first thing is that they need to be custodians for his wealth. And so when you look at an oligarch offshore and you say they have $20 billion, that's not all theirs. 10 of it belongs to Vladimir Putin. And so these people play a very important role for Vladimir Putin, which is the custodian of his offshore wealth. And they also do whatever they're asked to do when they're asked to do it.
Christy, could you follow up on that? Because I think we need to better understand how it is that if they're holding on to so much of his money, how is it he has so much control over them rather than vice versa?
I mean, these are people who were the old political elites coming out of the Soviet Union in some ways, and they made their money because of this. They were the people who were well poised to take advantage of Russia's capitalist transition. They made their money in a lot of underhanded ways, and they know this on some level, right? So I would agree that they are able to maintain this wealth at his leisure. They are not people who, I mean, they've been hedging against this in many ways. They've got second passports and things like that, but their position is entirely dependent upon staying in the good graces of the government.
Alexander, is that also the case for those who don't even live inside Russia?
Yeah, it's especially so. So for a while, we thought that this phenomenon of seeing the oligarchs go to places like the UK, founding Londongrad, and there were arguments made that interactions with the system of law, with the stock market, with boards of directors, with philanthropic circles and giving would somehow socialize them. Somehow it would tame them, make them more liberal. What we've seen is it's the exact opposite, that this idea that somehow integration with the West would make them more Western has proven a false hope.
Bill, let's do a little history here, in as much as we're going back more than 3 decades now to the collapse of the Soviet Union. How was it that so few people, we're talking about 118 Russian billionaires, were able to amass so much wealth so quickly as the country was sort of disintegrating from what it was and turning into what it's become?
Well, Russia is the most has the most inequality, the most concentrated wealth of any country in the world, and that comes from this what they called mass privatization. The original idea was in order to go from communism to capitalism, the Soviet government, well, I guess the Russian government right after the Soviet Union collapsed, would give away all property, quote, to the people for free. And that was the idea. But then you had these, and at the time it was a number much lower than 118. There were 22 oligarchs who basically, through very sharp elbows, very violent demeanor, and very close connections with the president at the time, Boris Yeltsin, were able to commandeer at the time about 40% of the GDP of Russia under their control. And it was all sort of total cowboy capitalism. The average Russian got nothing, literally nothing. And it was a terrible, terrible time. And the thought was, when Putin came to power, that he would somehow end this. But instead, Vladimir Putin became the biggest oligarch himself, and then made sure that a few of his friends and underlings and others joined the ranks of the oligarchs to get you to this 118 number you just quoted.
I wonder what your artificial intelligence algorithm, Polly, has picked up in terms of conspiratorial beliefs in Canada, which may or may not have been influenced by that convoy.
Yeah, it was really interesting. In the convoy, when it came to Ottawa, engaged a large sector of the population, not just in Ottawa, but across the country. And what Polly noticed was that the people who traditionally she would see in the center on the political spectrum started to engage very much with people who are normally on the alt-right. Now, normally these two groups don't intermingle, but because this was an issue that had such wide interest, mandates, the vaccine pandemic, people in the center started to engage with the alt-right and started to look into their conspiracy theories or their misinformation, and started to actually absorb some of these things and repost them. So, for example, the idea that the Prime Minister owns equity stake in some of the mRNA companies, and that's why he is promoting vaccines so much. that started to seep into the mainstream. And so then we saw conspiracy theories toward the government and the belief that the government was corrupt increase.
And just for the record, there's no evidence that that's the case, yes?
That's right. That's been investigated, and absolutely, the Trudeau Foundation does not own any equity in these mRNA technology companies.
Now, these thoughts often appear at the fringes and at the extremes of political thought, but are you suggesting here that Polly is picking up that people in the center are not just being exposed to it, but actually are believing it as well?
Yes, absolutely. So the idea, we saw that the belief that the government was corrupt really shot up during that whole period in the beginning of 2022. Not only did it shoot up, but for the first time in the 3 years that we've been monitoring this, Canadians were more likely to believe that their government was corrupt than Americans. We actually overtook the Americans in this belief. Now, in large part, that's because the belief that the government is corrupt in the U.S. has really fallen since Biden was elected. So it's a combination of that belief is going down in the U.S., but it's really going up in Canada. And so that's why we became very concerned about this, because it was the first time in 3 years that we've seen that Canadians believe that more than Americans.
Amarnath, your job is to sort of survey and monitor all of this. Do you think there is a thread that links all of these different conspiracy theories?
Yeah, I mean, we know from decades of research that moments of crisis always kind of lead to conspiracy theories of some sort, right? So 9/11, JFK assassination, a lot of the UFO-related conspiracy theories that we've seen in the 90s and so on, and pandemics, right? And so the pandemic was going to give rise to conspiracy theories. That was kind of a given because a lot of what scholars talk about with relation to proportionality bias, I think, plays out here, that a big event must have a big cause of some kind, right? That a bunch of guys with box cutters couldn't have brought down, couldn't have brought America to its knees. A guy in the book depository couldn't have assassinated a living president, and so on. And so this idea that random or large events must have equally large causes, I think, drives a lot of these kind of distrust and conspiracy theories that we've seen.
Mis and disinformation needs both a supply and a demand. And of course, we have a similar demand in Canada to these kinds of things as in the U.S. I mean, we're no different to being susceptible to this kind of false information. But with elections, there just wasn't enough supply. There weren't enough people who wanted to spread this kind of content during an election. Whereas now with COVID, because of the American market and our proximity to it, there was a huge financial incentive for people to create this supply of mis and disinformation and conspiracy theories around COVID. And because we're so connected, that seeped in through what we call in our work misinformation pathways into the Canadian market.
Back in the 1990s, the Liberals came out with something called their Red Book. This is federally, Jean Chrétien, and there's no question it helped them win. The Progressive Conservatives under Mike Harris in the middle 1990s came out with a common sense revolution. Again, no question it helped them win. 4 years ago, Doug Ford's Conservatives didn't have a platform at all, and yet they won. So the question, Michael, start us off. Is a platform really all that crucial to a party's electoral success?
I mean, I think it is. I think it's one of those incredibly important elements, but I would sort of underline elements. I mean, it is it's one piece. And I think what's important in the two documents that you mentioned, in many ways, it was less the specific content in the documents than the direction that the document signaled to the electorate. And that's one of the key pieces of a platform. I hear a lot of average voters say, I can't make up my mind till I read the platform. And with all due respect, not a lot of average voters read the platform. But they do take from the platform and how it's analyzed a very, very strong signal about what they can expect in terms of a potential government's values, its priorities, et cetera. So important, yes, but one of many ingredients that go into helping voters decide which way they're going to go on election day.
Kate Graham, how about you? You've spent an awful lot of your life over the last many months putting together the Liberals' platform that they will take to the voters in less than 100 days. How important do you think it'll ultimately be in whether the Liberals are successful?
So you won't be surprised to hear me say this, but I think it's enormously important. And not just the document, but more importantly is how we got there. So Ontario Liberals, as you know, we got a very clear message from voters in 2018, and we have spent the better part of the last 4 years listening, reconnecting with people, and really trying to get a sense of what matters to people and appreciating the changed realities that a lot of people are living through right now. So that has meant everything from surveys of thousands of people, not just Liberals, looking for good ideas. It's meant Zoom calls of 1,000 people where we stay on till the last person who wishes to speaks. It's meant a lot of quiet conversations with experts and stakeholders and particular communities. We are listening and building a platform that I believe will respond to what people are looking for right now. So the platform matters, but where I started, and I very much believe that the process of getting there, bringing people together, providing a meaningful opportunity for people to speak up about the things that they care about, that's what politics is supposed to be all about. So building a platform can be this amazing opportunity to give people a chance to have their say and put their fingerprint on a plan that represents, a better path forward for us as a province.
Abhijit, how about you on that?
Yeah, I think the fact that the 2018 election won Doug Ford a victory over something like buck a beer was incredibly troubling. But I think it's not something as an indicator of what's to come. But I think more so, I think it was a factor about the sheer huge anti-incumbency factor that was weighted against the Wynne Liberal government. But I think a platform is absolutely crucial because, as Michael, as my fellow panelists pointed out, there are massive vision that you're put forth towards voters about who the party is, what the leadership is like, and what kind of ideas that they're going to be putting forward, and that is a good indicator of where that party currently is and what kind of government they will be forming. For us Greens, we recognize that we won't be forming the next government. Probably, politics is strange and stranger things have happened, but we recognize that we want to be an important part of a minority government that comes about in 2022 in June. And what kind of partners will Greens be in that minority government? That's the kind of vision that we put forward.
We're hearing this term culturally safe and appropriate care, and it really comes to the essence of making sure we understand who is the person that we're working with. Because while we might even just look the same, we all have different lived experiences. We might have different cultural backgrounds and needs. We may have different experiences of trauma, and understanding who the person is, what experiences they have, understanding their cultural preferences, their dietary preferences. These are all ways in which we can provide what we call cultural safe and appropriate care. Everything from the language we use, the food we serve, the way in which we interact with something. These are all ways in which we express what we call culturally safe and appropriate care.
Now, Joe, I'm going to get a follow-up on that. What does that exactly look like in a care setting?
So in a care setting, for example, if we take an example of a long-term care home, that would be having recreation services which are culturally appropriate. For example, right now, if we look at the way recreation services are set up, they're mostly like bingo and, reminiscing about old 30s and 40s, which are embedded in Western culture. So not really specific, as well as, the services in terms of the food that's being provided there, even though there are ethnically specific cultural homes that do cater to individual needs. The wait times are long and they're not that readily available.
Samira, I want to follow up with you. Who exactly determines what is a culturally appropriate care setting?
Well, right now, it really depends on the organizations that may be funded or organize themselves to provide that. So the government of Ontario, for example, or in other jurisdictions don't necessarily determine who can provide this type of care or how they can provide it, but they can certainly enable it. Because, for example, if you're an ethnocultural community and you say, we would like to build a home that's providing care for Italian Canadians or South Asian Canadians, for example, you can provide that privately, you can organize it yourself through donations, or you might be able to receive government funding that helps you to provide services like long-term care services, adult day programs, other things. So it really is kind of a partnership in some ways between members of a community determining what type of care they want to provide, and sometimes the government that will enable the provision of that care. So it can be, so nobody specifically determines that. And that's why you can see a huge variation in the availability and the quality and types of culturally appropriate and safe care that's available across Canada and specifically in Ontario.
Josh, you went through the experience of moving your mother into a long-term care home that wasn't culturally appropriate for her. Can you tell us a little bit more of your experience with that?
Well, in her case, she didn't really have a choice because her condition got worse fairly quickly. So it's more or less like a crisis situation. So from the hospital, they had to find a place because the way they explained to me was a flight risk, meaning she needed to be in an environment where there is access controls, limits the ability to leave. So she ended up being in an Alzheimer's ward. So there's a lot of restrictions, and basically in that situation, she was literally in jail because there was nothing in her background that sort of associated with it. So it was very difficult.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find the full conversations on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's all for this Friday, March 11th, 2022. Next week marks 2 years since Ontario declared the pandemic state of emergency. We'll look back and forward as that fateful anniversary arrives. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thank you for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, and Steve will see you on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.